Hello and welcome. Slight change of schedule here. So we were going to do the BMW 2002 vintage touring car for this video. Whilst we were working with it, we found a few little issues that Marc raised directly with Reiza, and they wanted to have a closer look at the car. So it didn't seem to make much sense to continue with the BMW at this point. So we've postponed that video, and instead we've moved on to the next car in line, which was going to be the Ginetta G40 Cup. Now, worth mentioning, this setup is for the Cup version of this car. It doesn't carry over that nicely to the GT5 version. That will have to follow another day, I think. So if all you're interested in is the setup itself, the last minute of the video is where you'll find a setup sheet for both units and for rates. Feel free, head over there. If that's all you need, then that's fine. We understand, it's not a problem. For those that are looking for the detail of how we arrived at this setup, that's what's going to be coming up between now and that last minute or so. So, coming up in this video, we're going to go through details about the car itself, how we found the default setup and what we felt needed work on it, and then generally what the car was like to work with. We'll also just highlight anything which we found that was a little bit odd with the car that might be relevant when it comes to talking about the setup itself. Then we'll go through the process of what we went through to develop this setup, and then we'll then get into what circuits it was used at as part of that process, before we then get into the actual setup itself, and we'll talk through the various different parts of it and how it differs to the default setup. Then we'll get into any suggested adjustments that you may or may not wish to make if you wanted to move it more towards your way of driving. Maybe it's, if you give it a go and you think, oh, I wish it could do this, or I wish it did that a bit differently, we can give you some pointers and some suggestions on what things to change to likely give you the result that you're after. Once we've done that, we'll then get into what's next. So, without further ado, let's get into the details about the car. So the car itself, the default setup for this car is actually pretty good. It had a couple of sort of minor things that we wanted to try and dial out a little bit. Now, when I describe it, they're going to sound like they're quite major, but actually they only did it to a relatively small degree. So really and truly, the default setup's pretty good here. But we found that it had a slight tendency to lock a wheel. We found it harder than maybe necessary to modulate the brakes. It wasn't that the brake bias was necessarily too far forward, but more that the brake pressure might have been just a little bit too high. But we weren't really sure, wanted to have a closer look at it. We found that it had a little bit of push, as in a bit of understeer in the middle of the corner, and also had a little bit of push on exit if you applied the throttle sensibly. So if you got on the throttle gently, the rear would bite and it would kind of like push the front out towards the outside of the circuit. But then that lured you into driving more aggressively on the throttle. Now, if you drove more aggressively on the throttle, whilst you still had a lock on, you would then have a tendency for the rear to get quite snappy. Even though it hasn't got a lot of power, it would get a little bit snappy. So, for a momentum class and a car of this nature, the default setup, while it's a good starting point, there was certainly room for development to improve the situation. So that's where we come in now, isn't it? So the car has got some quite interesting things about it. The biggest interest for me was the fact that it's got a geared diff. It doesn't use clutches, and it doesn't use preload. It uses a ratio of gears to transfer the power from one side of the car to the other, and we'll get into that later. But it's a very different sort of diff. It achieves similar thing but in a very different way. So, and I've never driven a car with a geared diff before, and I was quite keen to get into here and give it a go. So but we'll get into more detail of that in a little while. credit to the car as well. It's so not only credit to Reiza for the default setup being pretty good, but the car itself was quite clearly going to be one of those cars that was easy to work on. It was going to be reactive to changes, so that was a really nice, encouraging thing to have right from the very start. The car uses its tyres nicely. It had a slight tendency with the default setup to use the fronts a bit more heavily than the rears, and that was one other area we wanted to try and even out a little bit if we possibly could. But it was also quite clear as well that the tyre wear rate front to rear was very much in the control of the driver and how you drove the car. So it wasn't all plain sailing though. There's a couple of little oddities that we wanted to share with you before we get into more detail. So let's get into the oddities that the car has now. So the car's got a couple of little things. Now, one of them is something that we've seen before. It's becoming a bit too common for our liking, so we're going to raise it with Reiza and see what they can find. But once again, if you're setting up the car with rates, or if you're setting up the car with units, if you're using units, you have multiple spring rate options, both front and rear, available to you. But if you're using rates, you're fixed to a single spring rate. So we've developed this setup based upon the one that's available if you're using rates. But again, we've seen this with other cars. I think this is the first time we've seen it with both front and rear affected. Normally it's just one end or the other, but even so, I think we're sort of gathering enough information now to be able to submit something to Reiza for them to actually be able to work with. At the moment, it's a little bit loose in terms of what we've found, but hopefully we're building up a big enough picture that we can actually help them with it rather than just sort of like complain to them. So the other thing that was a bit odd with the car is that it's got bump stops enabled, but you can have 0mm or 18mm, and whichever option you choose, they don't ever really seem to be active. So in terms of, you know, on the car itself, they don't ever seem to be making contact. So that's a bit weird, and we're not sure if that may be a mistake in the UI or not. But either way, yeah, we've left them as default in the setup. And lastly, for a car of this size and the sort of circuits that you'd expect it to race on, the default gear ratios were oddly quite tall. So it's not a problem because you can change it and you can change the final drive, but it's something that you'll probably play with quite a bit depending on what circuit you're on. But it just struck me as a little bit odd that they were as high as they were, or as tall as they were, considering the sort of circuits that it's going to race on. But other than that, didn't notice anything else that was that was strange or odd with it. So really, it's been quite a nice car to work with. Right, let's get into the timeline of how this setup has been developed. Right, strap yourselves in. It's a bit of a story here. So spent a bit of time with the car with the default setup, just acclimatising myself to the car. This is a standard thing that I'll do, and whilst using it, it was quite clear there were some areas of improvement, as I've already mentioned. But I do need to say, I think credit to Reiza that the default setup really is only requiring subtle things, and I think that's a really, bearing in mind how often the game is being adjusted in the background, they can't go through every single car every single time and readjust it. So for it to still be where it is, I think is really pretty cool. Anyway, so once I'd finished driving the car with the default setup, I then started to work towards trying to understand and dial in those small areas of improvement that I felt were needed from the default setup. I went down a few rabbit holes, as is always the case. It's very rare you just go bang 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 and you're there. It's very rare. So go down a few rabbit holes, try a bit of this, try a bit of that, see what works, and then see what doesn't. And the car will generally tell you what is the right way to go or not. Whilst I was doing that, I was also trying to balance out the front and rear tyre wear a little bit so I could drive it a bit more aggressively without killing the front tyres. I say that's over-egging it, not killing, but without using the front tyres more than the rears, like it was. And I was struggling to get that so I could drive it harder and still maintain that same or the correct balance of wear. And I went through a number of hours of experimenting for different solutions, and I never really fully settled on a proper one. Never really found what I was really looking for. And it takes a long time to do this work because you only really find out these answers on the longer runs for tyre wear. And I'm not a massive fan of using the multipliers if I can help it, but I think I might have to start getting comfortable with using those because otherwise you just sink so much time into it. And it's very difficult to know until you get really far into it whether or not your test is valid or not. But that's for me to worry about. But I just thought I'd get it in there just so that you can maybe get a feel for the amount of time and work that goes into it. But anyway, after a few iterations of my own settings and trials, I settled on a sort of like a path that I was sort of seeing the results I was hoping to see, but I was never really fully satisfied. And we'll call this version 1.2 because there was version 1.0 and 1.1 prior to that, but we'll call what I eventually settled on as a okay, this might be the direction I want to go as version 1.2. But I got to the point where I was almost blind to it now because I was working with it so much that I wasn't really able to really see its faults anymore. So I needed now to send that to Marc and Peter, really, to go and just get their view on it, just get a second set of eyes on it, or a second and third set of eyes on it. Now, whilst I was developing 1.2, Peter, in the background, was also developing his own, completely separate to me. He had his own ideas and his own method of working, and he was working on his own. So after I sent him my version 1.2, he sent me his version. We'll call that version 1.3p. So we'll suffix it with a p so we know it's Peter's. Anyway, I tried his version 1.3p, and it was really, really good. It was better than mine, and it really highlighted that I'd gone down the wrong rabbit hole and hadn't identified it early enough and hadn't backed out of it. And it was showing a lot of very good promise. So I immediately after that sent that setup, version 1.3p, over to Marc, and he assessed it against the default. Now Marc again has been tied up with the latest release, version 1.6.8.5 I think it is. So he's been tied up with that, so he only had time to compare Peter's 1.3p version with the default setup, and I was okay with that because Marc's comments after trying it were very much the same as what mine were, and so I was more than happy to then roll with that. And then so my version 1.2 basically was put to one side, and full focus went on to Peter's version 1.3p. So Marc's bit there was largely done now, because he was so busy with the other stuff. I then took Peter's 1.3p and did the usual things that we're now seeing by lowering the tyre pressures and that sort of thing to get it more to my driving style, because I'm more aggressive than Peter in my driving style. We are seeing that I need to generally run my tyre pressures lower than he does. So I tailored it to my driving style, and that then became version 1.4p. Once I got it there, so now it's basically Peter's setup, but for me now. I then took it to other circuits and ran it in wet and dry conditions for each one I went to. And over the course of time, I found myself benefiting from just taming the rear of the car down a little bit, and just made it a bit more user friendly, a bit more race setup like. And that setup became version 1.5. And at which point, the new AMS2 version 1.6.8.5, it's a mouthful, isn't it, was then released. So I needed to then go back and check what was now version 1.5 just to make sure that everything was still okay with the newest version. I couldn't find any discernible difference with the new version, but I did develop it a little bit further, not because of the software changes or the game changes, but just because I found just a couple of little extra bits and pieces just to make it even more user friendly and more race setup like. So it's worth saying that so Peter's setup would be great for a TT setup, and so 1.4, the previous version, would have been brilliant as a TT setup. 1.5 is more suited to a race setup. So that's the long story of it. Version 1.5 is what we have here. I do need to stress this is largely Peter's setup. There are changes that I have tweaked on it, but everything that we found that was good came from Peter's work, and in this case. Now, in this setup process and this actual development process, we have taken it to, in wet and dry conditions for every one of these. I'm not sure which tracks Peter used in full, but I know that he took it to the Le Mans circuit for certain. So I took it to Snetterton 300, Alton Park Island, Cadwell Park, Sebring Club, as you can see here, Brands Hatch Grand Prix, the Velo Sitter circuit, the main circuit, and Velo Park 2017. They're the circuits that this setup has been developed with and on, and it's a good rounded set of circuits that fit the car and the sort of circuits that it's really designed for. So, with that said, we're now at the point where we just need to go through the setup and how it differs to the default. So let's get into that now, shall we? With tyres, brakes and chassis, we're seeing once again tyre pressures being reduced a fair bit compared to the default setup, but Peter's tyre pressures were closer to the defaults than what they were to mine. So it might just be catering for the majority of people, and maybe I've got a bit of a weird driving style. Maybe I load the car up more than most people do. I don't really know. But the default pressures are 1.75 bar on the front and 1.8 bar on the rear, and mine are 1.6 bar on the front, which is as low as it can go, and 1.63 bar at the rear. So my front to rear is a little bit tighter packed compared to the default, but yeah, it's just a general trend that we're seeing. Outside of that, we then got the brake pressure. That was reduced from 90 down to 85. That was to give us just a little bit of extra modulation, which I mentioned earlier. We were sort of snatching brakes a little bit, and we just felt like it was harder than it maybe needed to be. Well, that was the fix for that. We just reduced that down 5% to 85%, and the brake bias actually went forwards by 1%. So the default 64% on the front, and ours is now 65%. The lateral weight bias stayed 50-50 because it's a generic setup. If you were running on a clockwise circuit, you may want to consider running it biased towards the right, so the right hand number is bigger. And if you're running on an anti-clockwise circuit, you may want to consider running it so the left hand side number is bigger. And all that is, it just means that the left hand side of the car is a bit heavier than the right hand side of the car when the left hand number is bigger. Basically, it just, if you're on an oval circuit, for example, you'll want the weight on the inside of the car because it helps the inside tyres out. It's that sort of thing. But for a generic setup, 50/50 all day long. Right, let's get into the suspension. Right, suspension. Front camber angle remained the same as the default at minus 2.5 degrees negative camber. The front ride height was increased by 2 millimeters. I found this to be quite a powerful change, actually. I found that if I was to reduce the front ride height below 88 millimeters, well, even actually anything below 92, really, you can feel it. But it raising it a little bit helped to remove some of the snatchiness of the rear end at the apex on the brake. So as you're trail braking into the corner, if I lower the front ride height, the car is far more prone to just kicking the rear end out just as you're starting to really like properly load the car up. So I found that just raising the ride height just smoothed out the whole corner, and for a momentum class like this, it was that was what I was looking for. Now Peter ran it a little bit lower. I think Peter was at 88 millimeters, but for a race and for a TT, that's spot on because you'll get a really good lap with that at some point. But with a race setup, you want 30 good laps in a row, not necessarily just one good lap in 30. So just smoothing out just helped it carry speed through and just looked after you better as well. The spring rate is fixed at 1, because obviously, well, it's the whole rates and units thing again. With units, you can run 1 or 2. I don't know if it makes any difference or not, but you have 2 options available in units. But in rates, you only have the 1, so we've fixed it as unit 1 for the front spring and the rear spring as well. Bump stops at 80mm. That's the same as default as well. It doesn't seem to matter whether you set it at, because you've got 2 options. You've got 0 or 18. It doesn't seem to matter which one you use. So we've left it as the default. The front damping has remained the same at 7 bump and 7 rebound as default. So the only change here on the front suspension is I've increased the ride height by 2 millimeters. That's how close the default setup was. The default setup was very, very good. Onto the rear suspension now. So the rear camber has been reduced a little bit from minus 1.5 degrees negative camber to minus 1.2. Peter ran his a little bit higher. I preferred it just a little bit lower on mine, which is unusual. You'd expect a more aggressive driving style to require more camber, but I just preferred it with a little bit less. I found it really helped in the wet as well if I ran it with a slightly lower amount of camber. The rear ride height has been increased from 95 to 97. So really the whole car's been raised a little bit, just by a couple of millimeters. But so Peter ran his rear ride height at 97 as well. So he had a higher amount of rake in his car compared to me, for his setup. The spring rate remained as 1. Bump stops remained at 18. It was the same on the rear. They didn't seem to ever make contact on the rear either. And the bump and rebound damping has been reduced by 1 click from 7 down to 6 for each. So again, really very, very, very close. That we are talking fine margins. That was how good the default setup was. The steering lock was reduced from 24 degrees down to 20, and that was I've explained this before, but I think I need to do it again because it's a fresh video. So the steering lock is essentially the ratio between your degrees movement on the steering wheel and the degrees movement of the wheels themselves. So with a higher value steering lock, you have to move the steering wheel less to get the steering angle to change by X amount. And if you run it with a lower value, you have to move the steering wheel more to get X amount of steering lock. So reducing it just basically makes the car a bit less aggressive. and gives you and can give you a better feel for where the grip is on the front axle. You can go too far with it, so and if you reduce it too much, then you'll find that the car sort of feels like it's not responding to the same degree. The car feels like it's behind your steering wheel input, and if it's too high, then it feels like the car is ahead of your steering wheel input, and you'll sort of get to feel for where it's right. And for me and Peter, actually, 20 degrees was where it was at. The front toe angle was, well, depending on your terminology, it went from minus 0.1 degrees toe out to dead ahead 0.0. The anti-roll bar on the front stayed as 1. The rear toe angle was increased from 0.1 degrees toe in to 0.4 degrees toe in. Again, a bit of extra stability. Peter had his at 0.3. I preferred it at 0.4. Again, just that race setup difference. And the rear anti-roll bar stayed as 1 also. So really very, very similar. The biggest departure here is the steering lock and the rear toe in angle. Everything else is sort of little bits here, little bits there. So yeah. Right, let's get into the drivetrain, because the diff is the interesting part of this whole car. So into the drivetrain, and this is an interesting page to us, but we'll get the smaller details out of the way first. So fuel default level is 12 litres. We've got ours at 20. That will see you good for 30 minutes on pretty much every circuit. The fuel map stays as 1.00. You'll have 0.90 and 0.95 and then 1.00 as your options. 0.90 is like a lean fuel mixture, which is the least powerful. Then you've got 0.95, which is the medium fuel mixture, which is the middle strength as you'd expect. And 1.00 is your rich fuel mixture, which is the most powerful fuel mixture available to you. Medium or rich are kind of where you want to be with this car. If you go medium, you'll find that you're giving away just a little tiny bit. If you go rich, you'll find you've got just a slight edge. So depending on the nature of the racing you like, if you want to be the underdog, I'd run it on medium. If you like having just a slight edge, then run it on rich. Gear ratios, normally I wouldn't change gear ratios. Now, first, second, third, fourth and fifth, you're not going to touch. The only one that you're really going to play with here is the final drive. So the final drive is basically what the differential is the ratio of the differential. And then you got first, second, third and fourth and fifth are all the ones in the gearbox itself. So the default setup is 3.313 and where final drive is 3.594. And what that means is that you'll have a lower top speed potential, but you get there faster. And with the default setup, you are very rarely going to see the lights come on in top gear by the time you got to the end of the fastest part of any given circuit. You'd have to be on a very, very big circuit for that to happen. So 3.594 has been geared for Snetterton 300. So at the end of the back straight of the Snetterton 300 layout, you'll just start to see the lights start to come on. And that is about what you're looking for. So for any given circuit, you're looking for top gear at the fastest point on the circuit for the lights to start to come on for the gear change, basically. And you'll tailor that circuit to circuit. So there'll be some circuits there which you want it a bigger number again, and there may be some circuits, if it's a very long circuit, very fast circuit, where you might want to reduce it closer to what the default is. But for me, 3.594 was a better middle ground default sort of setup-y type setting for me. Right, so the differential. This is the most interesting part of this car. I'm not even going to bother trying to explain how a geared differential works. It's not the same as a torsion differential. They are inherently different. But what I'll do, and I think the best thing to do, is for me to find the best link I can and add that link to the description of this video so that you can then, if you're interested enough, nip over to that other video that has got someone that can explain it far better than I can in this video. And then you can get a better idea for what's going on in there. For now, all that we really need to worry about is that a bigger number there, so where it says bias ratio power 6.0 to 1, where that 6.0 is a bigger number, it basically means that it's transferring more of what would be the wasted torque of the unloaded spinning wheel over to the wheel that can still have, over to the wheel that's still got grip. That's the main thing, and if you reduce it, obviously then it's going to allow less torque to be transferred over, and you're going to end up with a wheel that's spinning more on the inside. So the default setup power ratio was 4.5 to 1. Ours has been increased to 6.0 to 1. Now that's just makes it a bit more aggressive on the rear, so it means you can drive it on the throttle more compared to the default. And the coast ratio has been increased from 2.7 to 1 to 4.0 to 1, and that means that when you're off power and you're trail braking into the corner, say towards the apex, it basically means that the rear of the car is just a bit more stable, and it doesn't move around as much. Now, that subject is far, far bigger than those few words I've used. But yeah, I would advise anyone who's got a keen interest in this car to research what a geared LSD is and how it works. And I think that would be a very wise thing to do. Okay, right, so that's the setup itself and how it compares to the default values. But let's say you're driving the car and you go, I don't know, I wish it did this a bit differently. I wish it did that a bit differently. I'm looking for this. What sort of things are you looking to change? What are the powerful changes that we've come across that are most likely going to be the ones that give you the result you're looking for? So let's get into that now, shall we? So you've driven the car. There's maybe a couple of things you want to change. Maybe it doesn't quite suit your style. What are the things you're going to want to change? Well, first thing to look at is probably going to be your tyre pressures. So in my case, I've got the front tyre pressure as low as it can go. Now, you might want to increase that by up to around about 0.1 of a bar. If you're going more than that, you're probably going a bit too far and you're probably looking in the wrong place. Now, mine are lower because it seems like over the course of time we're finding this out, I'm quite aggressive in my driving style and I put a fair bit of energy into the tyre. And because of that, my starting pressures then have to be lower to end up at the same operating pressure. So Peter, for example, who's a lot smoother than I am, he would start with a pressure of, say, 1.67 bar on the front. But by the time everything's all warmed up, we'll both be around about the same pressure whilst it's actually operating fully. And that's just because I'm putting more into the tyre, and therefore I need to have a bigger window of adjustment or range, if you like. So the rear pressure is pretty much a bit like the Mini. It's sort of done to taste. So mine's just looking for a little bit of just a tiny bit of aggressiveness from the rear of the car with an increase of 1.63 bar, and that's it. So if you want it a bit more aggressive, go up on the rear pressure. If you want a bit less aggressive, go down on the rear pressure. But just tailor your pressures so that they're in a sensible position and that the car feels right. The brake pressure is going to be another personal thing. So For us, it was about 85%. You may want it more, you may want it less, but if you're looking for a bit more modulation, reduce it. If you feel like you're struggling to get the car stopped, increase it. The brake bias is quite a handy change, and you probably will use it. In the wet, you might want to move it rearwards just to 1 or 2% maybe. But yeah, generally speaking, where it is now is about where you're going to want to put it. The weight bias left to right, I mean, I wouldn't worry about it. I mean, use it if you want to. It's not gonna be a major change. In the suspension, the ride heights are very, very powerful changes, and they have a big impact on how the car feels. You you will find that if you raise the front ride height, it really smooths the car out throughout the corner. If you go sort of down towards 88 or beyond, you'll risk the rear of the car getting quite loose as you really pitch into the apex of the corner. So just be wary of that. But it does give you a more aggressive front. If you lower the front ride height to say 88, it does give you a more aggressive front end, potentially faster, but more tricky to drive. I wouldn't go much more than 92 on the front, really. You could, but you might start to get into struggling to get the car turned if you go much more than 92. The rear ride height, really, if you want the car to be a bit more aggressive, raise it. If you want it to be a bit more stable, lower it. You don't want to go too much lower in the difference between the ride heights, because otherwise you get into negative rake situations. So be wary of that as well. Steering lock is, as ever, a very personal taste thing, a bit like the brake power. So drive it, get a feel for it. If you feel like the car is behind your steering inputs, increase the number. If you feel like the car is ahead of your steering inputs, decrease the number. Toe angle is quite powerful as well. If you put a negative number in there, you'll find that the car gets quite aggressive, especially as you're trying to get out of the corner. If you try and apply throttle with a steering lock still applied, with a negative toe in angle, you'll find that the rear of the car can get a little bit snappy. So just something to bear in mind. But having it at dead ahead 0-0 makes it quite nice and smooth. Both Peter and I both preferred it as that. Roll bars, same old story really. Increase it if you want to smooth out that end of the car or give that end of the car a bit less grip feeling, and then reduce it if you want to increase that grip feeling. For us, it was 1-on-1. The rear toe angle was very powerful. I wouldn't go much more than 0.6 degrees, but if you're looking for a bit more stability at the back of the car, you could try increasing that a little bit. And if you feel like the rear of the car is a bit too locked in, you could try reducing it a little bit as well. The rear anti-roll bar, another very powerful change. If you feel like the car is a bit too locked in as it currently is now, you can increase that to the second bar. I think there's a third option as well, but you probably won't want to use the third one, because if you increase the rear anti-roll bar, you'll find you get a bit less traction, and you'll probably struggle to get on the throttle without the rear getting loose. And then if the rear starts to slide, you're then losing forward drive, and you're not going forwards anymore. You're now going sideways. So with this sort of car, you need to be always moving forwards as much as you possibly can. And in the drivetrain, gear ratios. So the final drive, you probably will find yourself adjusting that quite a bit, and that'll be circuit to circuit. 3.594 has been geared to tailor for the Snetterton 300 layout. The end of the main straight at the back of the circuit, it's just starting to top out in fifth gear there, and that's the sort of size circuit this car is really meant for. But for a smaller circuit, you'll probably want to make the number bigger, and for a bigger circuit, make the number a little bit smaller. So a bigger number means that you accelerate 0 to 60 faster, but you don't have such a high top speed to reach. and a smaller number means you reach 60 in a slower time, but you can ultimately go faster at the top end. And with the rear differential, if you want to make the car a bit more stable when you're on throttle, or if it's a bumpy circuit, you could reduce the number. So in our case, you'd reduce that 6.0 down to something a little bit smaller. But if you wanted to have a bit more, if you wanted to make the rear a bit more lively on the exit of the corner, you can increase that 6.0 up a little bit. You can go up to 8. And Peter's setup was at 8, so you really can use it all if you wanted to. Now with the coast, if you wanted to get a bit more stability on entry to the corner from the rear of the car, then you can increase the number. And if you want them to make the car a bit more lively and allow it to rotate a little bit quicker and a bit more readily, then you can reduce the number. And they're really the main changes that we would look to make on this car. Have a play with it, see what you enjoy, see what works for you, and let us know in the comments down below how you get on with it. So that only leaves what's next. So next up, Group A BMW M3. I bet you thought it was going to be the Dodge Viper or something like that, didn't you? No, Group A BMW M3. I've got a bit of a history with this car. My dad used to race prepare one of these for a friend of his, and so I want to get into it. I want to see how it feels, and see what we can do with it. Right, well, I'm going to leave you there. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for supporting. If you try the setup, please do let us know how you get on in the comments below. And until the next time, I'll leave you with the setup in units and in rates, and we'll see you later.